Today we are living in a synthesizer renaissance with more affordable options coming to market in the last 5 years than probably the last 20. And with that affordability has come accessibility for a whole new generation of musicians finding interest in synthesized music. So for the beginner, where should they start? Today we're going to answer that question. Hi, I'm Zach Marr from Alamo Music here in San Antonio, Texas. You can find us online at alamomusic.com. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button and turn on your notifications. This is our Alamo Sound Lab channel where we go over all things music technology related. And today we're looking at the top 5 synths for beginners in 2020. And we're using a particular lens here. We didn't choose these 5 synths because they're alike, but we chose them because they're actually very different pathways into synthesis. Because, unfortunately, synthesizers are a rabbit hole. Fortunately or unfortunately. When you get into them, you tend to find yourself buying more and more. It's kind of like pedals or guitars. Each one has its own tone, its own flavor, its own characteristics, and there's a lot of kind of nuance to what they add to your sonic palette, your paintbrush, so to speak. And we picked out 5 that we think are all pretty different paths to beginning synthesis, and no one better or worse than the other, but all interesting and all worthy contenders for someone's first synthesizer. We also tried to keep in mind we wanted to choose simpler synths. You can get really complex instruments with synths, and I don't necessarily recommend jumping in the deep end when you're buying your first synthesizer. You can buy something that's very niche and kind of hyper specific for a specific function and sound, and you can also buy something that's incredibly deep and complicated that's just completely overwhelming you'll never really make that much progress in your understanding of synths, in my opinion, starting out with something too complicated. So we tried to pick 5 different pathways, all from different manufacturers doing amazing things. Korg, Yamaha, Roland, Arturia, Behringer, really all doing really interesting things in this space. And we also picked a variety of digital and analog instruments, and we even brought a polyphonic or a monophonic synth alongside most of these other polyphonic synths, because those are kind of important aspects to kind of decide in your path what you need to kind of choose: digital, analog, monophonic, polyphonic. And I'll explain a little bit what each of those terms means if you're not familiar as we go through each of these instruments. But these are the 5 we've chosen, and so today we're not going to rank them in order of best to worst. We're just going to start. And so I'm going to start with what I consider to be one of the most simple ones here, and it is the JU-06A. And the JU-06A by Roland, it's a digital synth, and it's a recreation of one of their classic synthesizers, actually 2, their Juno 60 and the Juno 106, which were 2 of the most classic synthesizers Roland ever created from the 80s. Very iconic. You can kind of, if you've looked them up before, it's the design and the vibe of it is of a Juno 60. And the reason we picked this one out as a great beginner synth, it's not the simplest one up here, but it's a great way to learn subtractive synthesis. And subtractive synthesis is probably the most common type of synthesis found in classic analog synthesizers, and fairly common, one of the most common used in today's world of synthesizers. And subtractive synthesis is a form of synthesis where you take a complex waveform, that's the basics of synthesis, it's a waveform, and you subtract down the complexities to sculpt it into a sound. And the Juno 60 and the 106 are fairly simple in their control parameters, so it's not completely overwhelming. In addition, the JU-06 is a digital synth, so you don't have any of the kind of maintenance issues that you get with analog synths. So it sounds fantastic. It's a great emulation of the classic analog synths, but you don't have to worry about any of the maintenance issues that you do have to worry with analog synths in general. And it also has great connectivity via USB. You can connect, and it's got a little speaker built in, so it's very portable. It's just a great overall beginner synth to learn subtractive synthesis on. It's got an arpeggiator built in, and it's got some effects. So it's one of my personal, the JU-06A and the 106 are two of my favorite analog synths of all time. And so it also gives you a great tonal palette to play with in your kind of toolbox. So I think it's a great unit. It's a lot of fun, and it's simple enough to learn the basics of subtractive synthesis. If you want to learn more about that, there's lots of videos on it. But it's a fairly basic set of parameters to kind of play with. And you have a sequencer and arpeggiator as well as a feature set added in. All kind of the basics without too much. It's basically everything you would need and without any of the weird stuff. So I think it's a great one to start out. Let's listen to how it sounds, and you can kind of decide for yourself. So I hope you got a sense of what the JU-06A offers. Also, I forgot to mention earlier, the chorus is considered a classic sound. People make pedals emulating the original chorus from the Juno 60, and for that reason alone, this little unit is fantastic. Again, this is one of my favorites of all time from a sonic standpoint, so I think it's a lot of fun. It's pretty affordable. Great way to start. So on to number two. Number two is the Yamaha Reface DX, and we chose this one because it is probably the best introduction to FM synthesis, which is a completely different type of synthesis than the subtractive synthesis found in the JU-06A. And don't let the kind of simple, small interface that's on this thing kind of trick you into thinking that this instrument is actually simple. FM synthesis is incredibly, it's difficult. It's more like programming and like programming and or doing math. It's not a simple form of synthesis. It was developed by Yamaha in the 70s and launched with the DX7 in the 80s. And the DX7 was a game changer for synthesizers. It ushered in the era of digital synthesis. It kind of, analog synthesizers from the 60s to the early 80s were the only thing available. Yamaha, with the release of the DX7 and FM synthesis, ushered in the era of digital synthesis. And so, again, this is a digital, it was always, the DX7 was always digital, so this is in the same spirit, a digital synth using FM synthesis. And it is simple, again, it's actually simplified from the original DX7. I think this is a 4-voice synth as opposed to a 6-voice in the original DX7. And it is a really powerful way to get into synthesis. They make it fairly intuitive with the pre-programmed sounds. It has a looper built in, and it has some basic effects. Very cool little piece from Yamaha. And it's really a part of a whole nother line of synthesis with FM synthesis. And if that kind of intrigues you, it's a totally different sound palette than the JU-06A and the subtractive synthesis Roland sound. Totally different. Great way to get into synthesis as well. And yeah, so let's take a listen. You can kind of see what you think about it. But a great piece by Yamaha, really affordable, really nice piece of gear. So FM synthesis is sometimes described as crystalline or metallic in tone, and it's kind of a counterpoint to the subtractive synthesis, which is often described as messy or kind of engulfing. It's a messier waveform and kind of more a broader sound. And I hope you kind of can hear that in the Reface DX. It's a really powerful instrument. Again, don't let the form factor deceive you on either of these instruments. They're incredibly small, but they are packed with power, and the amount of sonic possibility inside this thing is crazy. With its algorithms and its operators, it's really an incredibly powerful piece of technology. Really underrated. I think a lot of people did not understand these when they came out, but it's getting kind of a resurgence of interest in the last couple of years as the kind of interest in synthesizers has gone up. People are evaluating this and be like, wait, this is misunderstood. So with that said, let's go on to number 3, which is the Arturia Microbrute. And the Arturia Microbrute, we chose it for 2 reasons. 1, it's a monophonic synth, and 2, it has a small patch bay. And we chose it for those reasons because we wanted it as a contrast to the other synthesizers on this table. This is the first of the analog synthesizers we put on this kind of list, and monophonic versus polyphonic is a really important distinction in synthesizers. What that means is in a polyphonic synth, you can play multiple notes at the same time. On a monophonic synth, you can only play one note. And the kind of focus of a monophonic synth is sculpting the sound. So it's more like playing a bass or playing a violin. You're playing a melodic line, and you are focused on the nuance of that sound. You're less focused on the harmonics and kind of the pad or the kind of overall, like a chordal sound. You're focused very much on a single note and the complexity of that tone. So the Arturia Microbrute has 2 brothers. It has the Minibrute 2S and the Matrix Brute, which are fantastically powerful monosynths. But we chose this one because it's simpler. If you're going to learn how to synthesis, this is a very simple synth. It doesn't have a ton of kind of custom, the wave sculpting that you can do is a lot simpler than on even the Minibrute 2S, which has 2 oscillators, and oscillators are what make a noise in a synth. This has it's a single oscillator, and you kind of have a simple way of modifying it. And I think that's fantastic. I think if you're going to learn synthesis, you should start simple and then get more complex. It's maybe not as interesting sonically, but it's incredibly affordable, it's incredibly well built, and it has a little patch bay too. And why was patch bay important? There's another whole kind of subgenre of synthesis called modular synthesis, and subgenre is probably the wrong word. It's a huge genre of synthesis, and it's very complicated, and it's not highly recommended for a beginner. You can get into it, but if you want a kind of basic exposure to it, you can explore that in the Microbrute and kind of get a sense of how patching works, where you patch, it's a way of modulating sound, and you kind of patch in different signal paths. So very cool piece by Arturia. Let's take a listen, and you can kind of decide what you think. So one thing to note about Arturia is the value for your money. All of the analog instruments that they have are incredibly affordable and incredibly powerful and well built. And I honestly don't know how they make money creating these instruments. I think they must make all their money from the software, which is also fantastic. But these kind of analog instruments that they've created, I think are going to go down to be classic synths in the future. They're completely new. It's all their own design. It doesn't really reference anything in the past. And I have to applaud them for how awesome the Microbrute, the Mini Brute, the Drum Brute, all of the synths that they've come out with. They're very fantastic. You should totally check it out. So with that said, on to number 4, and it's the Korg Minilogue. And honestly, this is probably the JU-06A of today's synth renaissance. The JU-06A was kind of a ubiquitous, very popular synth in the early 80s, and today it's still considered, it's probably one of the most popular analog synths that people kind of harken back to. This is, in today's world, kind of everywhere. If you look on Instagram, maybe the reason you got into synthesizers because you saw someone doing something on a Minilogue. And it's Korg made this about, I think, 5 years ago. After kind of 7 years ago, they released something called the Volca series, which was very small, $150 analog modules, which are also fantastic. And it's a great way to get into synthesis. But the Korg Minilogue is such a powerful analog, all analog, 4-voice synthesizer. And any top 5 list on synthesizers today is probably going to feature the Minilogue or the Minilogue XD, which is a variant of the Minilogue, and deservedly so. It's an incredibly powerful. It's got 2 oscillators. It's polyphonic. It is more complex than the Microbrute, and you can use it as a monophonic synth. It is really fun to play with. The sounds in it are fantastic. It's fully featured. It has a sequencer, an arpeggiator, and it is hard to beat for the money. It's very inexpensive, so highly recommended. There's been so much said about this specific synth that I don't really have anything to contribute that hasn't already been said. But it should definitely be on your list of synths to potentially buy if you're a beginner. Great little machine. There's a lot of good used options, and even the new ones are not that expensive. So let's take a listen. Korg has really done amazing things with the Volca series and the Minilogue. Many argue that they were the ones to kind of precipitate the mass interest in analog synthesizers 7 years ago with the release of the Volcas, and you have to give them a lot of credit, even if you don't agree with that, for making analog synthesizers accessible to the masses again. Really cool work that they're doing. Also, it's awesome that these are new instruments. They're not necessarily retro recreations. They're completely new instruments with their own kind of flavor. Very cool. You have to check it out if you haven't before. Highly recommend it. So with that said, move on to the last piece in our top 5, and that's the Behringer Deepmind series. And the Deepmind is Behringer's flagship polyphonic analog synth that they kind of threw out there, I think in 2017, and people were blown away. No one had created as powerful a polyphonic synth at this price point in the last, I would say, maybe 35 years. No one has put out a 12-voice analog, all analog synth with as many features as this had. There were ones that were created that were, much higher price point by Dave Smith and I think Moog, but this, at this price point, kind of blew everybody away. And it was loosely based on a Juno 106, but really it is so much more than that with its feature set and with the effects that are built in. It's an incredibly powerful synthesizer and almost arguably too complex for a beginner, but at the same time, it follows the simplicity of the kind of Juno 106 interface. It's got a very similar layout to a Juno 60 or Juno 106. There are more parameters that you can kind of modify your sound with, but it's still fairly simple and intuitive for somebody getting into synthesizers. So we did include it. And if you're interested in a slightly more complex instrument and really something that is kind of a flagship instrument in your studio or in your kind of instrument collection, this is a really good place to look. It's a very powerful synth, and it comes in both desktop modules that are more like the JU-06A, and also kind of a smaller 6-voice module that are both that bring the price point substantially down. So let's listen to it. You can kind of get a sense for what it sounds like, and then we'll conclude. So really amazing technology from Behringer. Even though this is a few years old, I don't think it's lost its relevance, and the marketplace for it has only been increasing because more and more people have been getting into synthesis, and this is still the best option for a flagship polyphonic synth under $1,000. There's really nothing else that competes with it. It's on the upper end of the price point on all these synths, but definitely worth looking at if you want to kind of go deeper into the water of synthesis. So in conclusion, I want to kind of summarize where I think each of these fits if you're trying to choose which journey you want to take into synthesis. So if you are looking for just a simple way to get into classic analog sounds, the JU-06A is probably the best option. It's very classic in terms of the tones you get, and it's very simple to learn from a subtractive synthesis standpoint. Great build quality, that's what I'd recommend. If you're interested into FM synthesis, the Yamaha Reface DX is definitely where it's at. If you like the historical 80s kind of pop music, the DX7 was all over every record, and so that sound is much more Reface DX, whereas kind of synth pop was more the JU-06A Roland sound. So kind of very different tonally, also different types of synthesis to learn. So that's where, if you're into FM synthesis, this is where you should go. If you're just interested in classic Roland subtractive synthesis, that's where you should go. If you're more of a bass player or more of a lead player, I would say that the Microbrute might be the best option for you. It's definitely focused more on a single note. It's simple, and if you're interested in learning modular, it's got some basic modular functions to kind of get you familiar with how modular synthesis works. It's also incredibly affordable. It's the most affordable analog option out of these. It's not as affordable as a Volca's, but it's a lot more powerful than a Volca. Very cool piece. So that's what I would say would be best for you. The Minilogue, if you want something, if you're interested in kind of new synthesizers, you're not interested in analog past, the Korg Minilogue is probably the best option. It is fully featured analog synth at an incredible price point. I should also say, if you're interested in analog synthesis as opposed to digital synthesis or emulation, this is where you should go. Korg Minilogue, least expensive, very powerful kind of, it's not a flagship synthesizer in my opinion, but it's like a budget flagship, I should say. It's 4-voice, incredibly powerful. That's what I'd recommend. And if you're looking for a flagship polyphonic synth that's all analog, there's no other option but the Deepmind, unless you want to spend a couple $1,000s. This is an incredibly powerful all analog synth, and there's really nothing like it on the market yet. So that's kind of where all of these fit in, and I hope this has been helpful. If you have any comments, questions, if we left something out, please let us know below. You can find us online at alamomusic.com, and you can chat with us there, send us an email, call us. And if you didn't, please hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications. We're going to be putting out more content like this. We'd love to hear your thoughts about what we should do next, and we hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you for watching.